The air within the Rayburn House Office Building didn't just smell of lemon polish, dust, and aging mahogany. On days like this, it smelled of impending arson. To the casual observer watching on C-SPAN, the Judiciary Committee room was a bastion of order, a high-ceiling theater of democracy where the nation's laws were debated with gravitas. But to the Republicans sitting on the right side of the dais, the men and women who still believe that the Constitution was a document of limits rather than suggestions, the room felt less like a sanctuary and more like a trench. The fluorescent lights hummed with a headache-inducing frequency, casting a pale, clinical wash over faces that were already etched with the deep lines of exhaustion. It was late, or maybe just felt late. In Biden's Washington, time had a way of warping, stretching out into endless loops of crises manufactured and ignored. The mood on the GOP side of the aisle was a heavy, pressurized silence, the kind of silence that exists inside a submarine when the sonar picks up a torpedo in the water. They weren't waiting for legislation. They were waiting for the performance. They knew the drill. The cameras were rolling, the red tally lights blinking like unblinking eyes, and across the aisle, the stage was being set. Chairman Jim Jordan sat at the center of the dais, his posture deceptive. To the uninitiated, he might have looked relaxed, leaning back, jacket off as per his trademark, sleeves rolled up to the elbows. But anyone who knew the man, anyone who understood the burden of trying to conduct oversight on an administration that treated oversight like an optional hobby, saw the coiled tension in his shoulders. He wasn't relaxing, he was bracing. He scanned the room, his eyes darting from the scattering of aides whispering in the corners to the press gallery, where reporters sat like vultures on a telephone wire, waiting for the carcass of civility to be tossed out for consumption. The Republican members flinched inwardly at every rustle of paper. They were tired of the circus. They had come to D.C. with mandates from districts that were bleeding, towns crushed by inflation, borders overrun by cartels, communities where fentanyl was cheaper than milk. They wanted to talk about the law. They wanted to talk about the utter abdication of duty by the Department of Justice. But they knew, with a cynicism born of 1,000 similar hearings, that they were about to be subjected to something else entirely. On the other side of the aisle, the energy was different. It wasn't the heavy, stoic weight of responsibility. It was the kinetic, buzzing energy of a college theater troupe 5 minutes before curtain call. The Democrats huddled, whispering behind cupped hands, their eyes not on the legislative text in front of them, but on the angles of the cameras. They were curating clips. They were manufacturing viral moments. The modern Democrat strategy wasn't about winning the argument in the room. It was about winning the algorithm outside of it. And there, sitting with a posture that screamed confrontation, was Representative Jasmine Crockett of Texas. From the Republican vantage point, she was the embodiment of everything that had gone wrong with the House. She didn't seem interested in the nuances of federal statutes or the precedent of the committee. She sat there like a loaded weapon, her eyes scanning the Republican ranks with a look that wasn't curiosity, it was disdain. It was the look of a prosecutor who had already decided the verdict before the trial began. The GOP members could see the micro-movements, the slight twitch of her jaw, the way she adjusted her microphone not to ensure clarity, but to ensure volume. She was preparing to preach. A Republican aide, a young man with dark circles under his eyes, leaned in to whisper to a senior GOP member. "Here it comes," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the hum of the HVAC system. "They're going to pivot. They can't defend the border numbers, so they're going to play the emotion card." The senior member didn't turn his head. He just stared straight ahead, his gaze fixed on the empty space between the two parties. Let them, he thought, his internal monologue a bitter stream of consciousness. Let them scream. Let them cry. It's all they have left. They broke the country, and now they want to break the decorum of this room because silence would force them to hear the reality of what they've done. The atmosphere thickened. You could almost feel the barometric pressure drop. It was the specific, suffocating weight of performative outrage. The Republicans knew the playbook. The Democrats would take a tragedy, a genuine, heartbreaking tragedy, and they would weaponize it. They would strip it of its context, dip it in vitriol, and hurl it across the aisle like a grenade. It was a ghoulish alchemy that turned human suffering into political capital. The chair banged the gavel, a sharp, wooden crack that echoed off the paneled walls. It was supposed to be a sound of authority, a call to order. But in this era, in this room, it sounded more like the starting pistol for a brawl. The gentle lady from Texas is recognized to strike the last word, the chair announced. The words were formal, steeped in centuries of parliamentary tradition. Strike the last word. It sounded elegant. It sounded civilized. But as Jasmine Crockett shifted in her seat, the Republicans braced themselves. They saw the intake of breath. They saw the theatrical pause. They saw the way her eyes didn't look at the chair, but looked through the chair, targeting an audience that wasn't even in the room. This wasn't going to be a debate. This was going to be a lecture. A younger Republican member, fresh from a district that still believed in the sanctity of this institution, felt a knot of anger tighten in his stomach. He looked at his colleagues, men and women who had spent decades studying the law, who had prosecuted cartels, who had built businesses, and he saw them resigning themselves to the onslaught. It was a tragic tableau. The adults in the room forcing themselves to sit still while the petulant children prepared to throw food. The silence that preceded her speech was not respectful. It was predatory. It was the silence of a predator calculating the jump. Crockett arranged her papers, though everyone knew she wouldn't be reading from them. The facts didn't matter where she was going. The narrative was the only god she served. Yes, she began, her voice cutting through the stale air. Mr. Chair, I asked to strike the last word. The request was granted. The trap was sprung. The camera lights seemed to flare brighter, sensing the drama. The Republican members stiffened. They adjusted their ties, cleared their throats, and put on their game faces, the stoic masks of patience they wore to hide the screaming frustration beneath. They knew they were about to be called racists. They knew they were about to be called heartless. They knew that their legitimate concerns about the rule of law were about to be twisted into a caricature of villainy. The tragedy in question, a fatalized shooting, was a serious matter. A life had been lost. In a sane world, this committee would be dissecting the operational failures, the rules of engagement, the tragic circumstances that led to a death. They would be looking for answers. But the Republicans knew, with a sinking feeling in their guts, that Crockett wasn't looking for answers. She was looking for a villain, and she was looking right at them. The room felt smaller now. The high ceilings seemed to press down. The portraits of past chairmen, oil paintings of men who had steered the country through wars and depressions, seemed to look down with disapproval. The dignity of the House was a fragile thing, held together by unwritten rules of courtesy and mutual respect. And as Crockett leaned into the microphone, the Republicans could feel those unwritten rules dissolving, acid burned by the toxic polarization of the moment. One Republican congressman, a former military officer, tapped his pen rhythmically against his notepad. Tap, tap, tap. It was a subconscious release of aggression. He remembered a time when this committee was feared. Now it was a content farm. He looked at Crockett and saw not a colleague, but a content creator. She wasn't legislating. She was auditioning for MSNBC. The gentle lady is recognized. The voice from the chair repeated, perhaps with a hint of resignation. Crockett took a breath. It was a breath loaded with theatrical sorrow. Thank you so much, she said, but there was no gratitude in the tone. It was the sharp, saccharine politeness of someone about to twist the knife. It is so hard to sit here sometimes. Here we go, the collective mind of the GOP side thought. The victimhood, the martyrdom. Because I didn't come to Congress to write laws or to do things that are hurting people, she continued. The irony of the statement hung in the air like smoke. Didn't come to write laws? A Republican backbencher scoffed silently, hiding the expression behind a raised hand. We know, he thought. You came to make noise. The admission was startling in its honesty, even if she didn't mean it that way. To the Republicans, it was a confession. They were here to govern a republic. She was here to dismantle it in the name of a vague, undefined justice that always seemed to require the destruction of order. The temperature in the room seemed to rise. The aides in the back stopped whispering. The stenographer's fingers hovered over the keys, ready to capture the coming storm. The Republicans sat like statues, their eyes cold, their resolve hardening. They were the wall. They were the barrier against the chaos. And as the first waves of Crockett's rhetoric began to crash against them, they dug their heels in. They prepared for the insults. They prepared for the yelling. But they were not prepared for how low the bar was about to drop. They didn't know yet that this sanctuary of democracy was about to be turned into a schoolyard brawl. They didn't know that the ghosts of the Founding Fathers were about to cover their ears. The siege had begun. The microphone in front of Representative Crockett didn't just amplify her voice. In that moment, it seemed to distort the very reality of the room. When she said, "I didn't come to Congress to write laws," the sentence hung in the air, a naked admission that struck the Republicans as both bizarre and terrifyingly accurate. "We know," thought a senior GOP member, his fingers interlaced tightly upon the polished wood of the dais. That is precisely the problem. To the conservative mind, the legislature was a machine designed for a specific purpose: to craft the framework of a functioning society. It was about budgets, statutes, oversight, and the tedious, unglamorous work of governance. But to the modern progressive left, as exemplified by the woman currently commanding the floor, the House of Representatives had ceased to be a place of lawmaking. It had become a pulpit for moral chiding. Crockett leaned forward, her body language shifting from the casual slump of a committee member to the aggressive posture of an accuser. The transition was seamless, practiced. She wasn't speaking to the chairman anymore. She wasn't speaking to the record. She was speaking directly to the moral conscience of the Republican Party, or rather, to her caricature of it. "I'm just asking if there's any decency or heart or courage on that side of the aisle," she posited. The question was rhetorical, of course. It was a trap wrapped in a query. If they answered, they were defensive. If they stayed silent, they were complicit. On the Republican side, eyes narrowed. The word decency felt radioactive coming from the other side. To the GOP members, decency meant upholding the laws that kept citizens safe. Decency meant securing a border so that fentanyl didn't wipe out a generation of rural Americans. Decency meant supporting the men and women in uniform, Border Patrol, ICE local police who stood on the thin line between order and anarchy. But here was Crockett redefining the word in real time. To her, decency was synonymous with submission to her worldview. To her, heart meant the suspension of logic in favor of unchecked emotion. A palpable wave of irritation rippled through the GOP ranks. It wasn't the loud, boisterous anger of a bar fight. It was the cold, hard resentment of professionals being lectured by an amateur. They watched her perform. They watched the way her voice modulated, dipping into a register of profound disappointment, as if she were a kindergarten teacher scolding a room of unruly toddlers. "The fact that a woman was killed," Crockett continued, her voice gaining a sharp, serrated edge. "She was shot in her head." She let the graphic detail land. Shot in her head. The room went deadly silent. This was the bloody shirt tactic, a political maneuver as old as Rome. You take a corpse, you hold it up high, and you dare your opponents to look away. For the Republicans, the tragedy of the event wasn't in dispute. A life lost is a tragedy, period. But they knew the context that Crockett was deliberately omitting. They knew the complexities of law enforcement encounters, the split-second decisions, the adrenaline, the fog of war that descends when officers are threatened. They understood that ICE shootings didn't happen in a vacuum. They happened in the context of enforcement operations against individuals who had broken the law, often individuals with criminal records, often in volatile situations. But nuance had no home here, not in Crockett's narrative. "And y'all are pretending like nothing happened," she accused, sweeping her hand toward the right side of the aisle. The accusation hit the GOP members like a physical slap. Pretending? Chairman Jordan remained motionless, his face a mask of stone. But behind that mask, the gears were turning furiously. They weren't pretending nothing happened. They were waiting for the investigation. They were waiting for facts. In the Republican worldview, justice was a process, not a feeling. You didn't condemn an officer before the report was filed. You didn't declare a shooting murder based on a tweet or a headline. That was the difference between a court of law and a mob. But Crockett wasn't interested in the court of law. She was leading the mob. "Y'all," she said again, that colloquialism weaponized to draw a distinct line in the sand. "Y'all, the other, the enemy, the heartless." One of the Republican backbenchers, a man who had served in law enforcement for 20 years before running for Congress, felt his blood pressure spike. He looked at Crockett and saw the utter disconnect from reality. Did she know what it was like to wear a badge? Did she know the weight of a gun on your hip, knowing that if you used it, your life was over, and if you didn't, your life might be ended? No. She sat in an air-conditioned room, surrounded by security details paid for by tax dollars, and judged the men and women who walked the dark alleys. It was the ultimate luxury of the elite left, to despise the very people who protected them. The camera zoomed in on Crockett. She was in her element now. The tragedy was fuel. She was burning it to generate heat, to generate outrage. "I remember when Charlie Kirk got killed," she said, invoking a name meant to trigger a specific reaction. "Do you remember what our response was?" The Republicans stiffened. The comparison was coming. The false equivalency. The whataboutism that the media claimed only Republicans used, yet here it was being deployed with surgical precision by a Democrat. "Our response wasn't to sit there and pretend like it was okay," she declared, answering her own question. The arrogance was breathtaking. She was rewriting history in real time, painting her party as the paragons of empathy and the Republicans as stone-cold sociopaths. It was a Manichaean worldview where the Democrats were the children of light and the Republicans were the children of darkness. There was no room for policy disagreement. There was no room for "we have different approaches to crime." No, to Crockett, the disagreement was biological. "We have hearts," she was saying, "and you do not." The air in the room grew heavy, stagnant. It was the feeling of being trapped in an elevator with someone who is screaming. There was nowhere to go. You just had to endure it. A young legislative aide on the Republican side typed furiously on his BlackBerry, sending a message to the communications director. "She's going off the rails. Get the clips of her anti-police rhetoric ready. We're going to need to counter-program this immediately." But the members themselves couldn't check their phones. They had to sit there. They had to take it. To react would be to give her what she wanted, a viral clip of an angry white Republican man yelling at a black woman. That was the trap. If they defended themselves, they were bullies. If they stayed silent, they were guilty. It was a rhetorical pincer movement, executed with ruthless efficiency. Crockett paused for effect, looking around the room as if searching for a single soul on the Republican side who might meet her gaze. The Republicans refused to give her the satisfaction. They looked at their papers. They looked at the ceiling. They looked at the clock. Just let her finish, the collective thought ran. Let her burn herself out. But she wasn't burning out. She was ramping up. "Is it okay because you have a badge?" she asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Because the last time I checked, allegedly no one is above the law." Allegedly. The word was thrown in like a legal disclaimer, but the tone suggested the verdict was already in. The hypocrisy of the statement was almost blinding to the GOP members. No one is above the law. This coming from the party that ignored immigration statutes? This coming from the party that allowed cities to burn during the Summer of Love? This coming from the party that turned a blind eye to the corruption within their own ranks while weaponizing the DOJ against their political opponents? It took every ounce of discipline for Chairman Jordan not to bang the gavel right then and there. The irony was so thick you could choke on it. Here they were, the party of law and order, being lectured on the rule of law by someone who had spent her career advocating for the dismantling of the very systems that enforced it. Crockett's eyes flashed. She was building to something. The tragedy of the ICE shooting was just the appetizer. The main course was going to be a direct assault on their character. "Can y'all not just have a little bit of courage and humanity?" she implored, her voice cracking slightly. Whether from genuine emotion or professional acting, the Republicans couldn't tell. In this town, the difference was negligible. Courage, thought a Republican congressman from a border district. You want to talk about courage? Courage is looking a constituent in the eye and telling them why their son is dead from an overdose because we can't secure the border. Courage is voting for the hard bills that unpopularly cut spending to save the country from bankruptcy. Courage isn't grandstanding in a committee hearing with no consequences. But he said nothing. He couldn't. The rules of the House, the decorum that hung by a thread, demanded his silence. A child, Crockett snorted, a derisive sound that echoed in the quiet room. The child has lost her mom, and you'll want to pretend that it is okay. She was hammering the point home. Child, mom, dead. You don't care. It was a simple, brutal equation. It stripped away all political context, all nuance, all legal reality, and left only raw, bleeding emotion. It was effective. It was devastating. And it was deeply, profoundly dishonest. The Republicans knew that no one on their side thought it was okay. That was a lie, a straw man built of hay and malice. They grieved for the loss of life, but they refused to dismantle the mechanism of law enforcement because of tragedy. That was the fundamental divide. The Democrats believed that if a system produced a tragedy, the system must be destroyed. The Republicans believed that the system must be improved, but preserved because the alternative was chaos. And chaos was exactly what Jasmine Crockett was inviting into the room. As she took a breath to launch her next salvo, the atmosphere shifted again. The sorrow was fading from her voice, replaced by something hotter, something more volatile. The prelude was over. The weaponization of the tragedy was complete. She had established the moral battlefield. I care, you don't. Now, she was ready to unleash the artillery. The Republican members braced themselves. They could feel the shift. The F-bomb wasn't just a slip of the tongue. It was an inevitability. When you abandon reason for emotion, when you abandon protocol for performance, profanity is the natural linguistic destination. It is the language of the street brought into the temple of the law. And Jasmine Crockett was about to kick the doors of the temple wide open. The hearing room was now a pressure cooker, the safety valve soldered shut by the sheer intensity of Representative Crockett's performance. To the Republicans on the dais, what they were witnessing was no longer a legislative statement. It was a psychological assault. The air conditioning hummed a low, monotonous drone, completely indifferent to the human drama unfolding below. But for the members of the GOP, the temperatures seemed to be rising with every syllable that left Crockett's lips. I'm asking if there is anyone that will stand for the very people that elected us and sent us to Congress, she demanded, her voice rising in pitch, cracking slightly at the edges. It was a question designed to look like a plea for representation, but to the Republican ear, it sounded like an indictment. The very people that elected us. Representative Chip Roy, sitting stoically on the right, felt a muscle in his jaw jump. He stared at the papers in front of him, the text blurring as his mind raced. We are standing for them, he thought, the internal monologue fierce and defensive. We are standing for the rancher in Texas who finds bodies on his property. We are standing for the mother in Ohio whose son bought a Xanax online that turned out to be pure fentanyl. We are standing for the taxpayer who watches their city crumble while billions are funneled into housing foreign nationals who broke the law to get here. But in Crockett's world, those people didn't count. In her narrative, the people were a specific subset, carefully curated to fit the victimhood hierarchy. If you were a law-abiding citizen terrified of the crime wave sweeping your neighborhood, you weren't the people, you were the oppressor. The mask of the concerned legislator was beginning to slip. In the beginning, she had played the role of the grieving advocate, the voice of the voiceless. But now, the grief was evaporating, revealing the hard, jagged rock of partisan hatred beneath. She wasn't sad anymore. She was angry, and that anger was looking for a target. You tell us things like, well, the immigrants are bad, she mocked, pitching her voice into a crude, cartoonish impression of conservative. And so we got to get all these bills because the immigrants are the ones that are causing the harm. They're bringing the crime. The straw man was so large it practically scraped the ceiling of the committee room. A collective ripple of disbelief moved through the Republican ranks. It was a physical reaction, a shifting of weight in leather chairs, a synchronized rolling of eyes, a sharp intake of breath. This was the Democrat tactic distilled to its purest essence. Simplify the opponent's argument until it sounds like bigotry, then attack the bigotry you just invented. No one said immigrants are bad, thought a senior GOP aide standing near the back wall, his arms crossed tight across his chest. We said illegal immigration is bad. We said unvetted entry is dangerous. The distinction was crucial. It was the difference between xenophobia and national security. It was the difference between hating a person and loving the law. But Crockett, like a magician performing a sleight of hand, made the word illegal vanish. In her retelling, the Republican position was simply a hatred of the foreigner. It was a lazy, intellectual dishonesty that infuriated the GOP members more than the shouting did. It was the arrogance of someone who believes their opponents are not just wrong, but evil. The room felt suffocating. The room, as a character, was no longer a passive observer. It was an accomplice. The acoustics of the Rayburn building, designed to amplify debate, were now amplifying distortion. Every word she spoke bounced off the wood paneling, echoing, doubling back, filling the space until there was no room for rebuttal. The mayor of Minneapolis told y'all to get the... She started, and then she paused. Time seemed to suspend. The milliseconds stretched out. The Republicans watched her face. They saw the micro-expressions flashing like strobe lights. The hesitation, the calculation, the defiance. She was standing on the precipice of decorum, looking down into the abyss of street slang and deciding whether to jump. It was a moment of profound revelation. The mask didn't just slip, it fell off and shattered on the floor. Minneapolis. The mention of that city was a tactical nuke. To the Republicans, Minneapolis wasn't just a city, it was a crime scene. It was the epicenter of the defund the police movement that had demoralized law enforcement across the nation. It was the place where the 3rd Precinct had been allowed to burn while the mayor, the very mayor she was quoting, had seemingly stood by. And now, she was using that mayor as a moral authority? A Republican member from the Midwest leaned back, a bitter smile touching his lips. It was a smile of disbelief. You're quoting the architects of the chaos to lecture us on order? He thought, this is rich. This is beyond rich. This is hallucinogenic. Crockett's eyes were hard, focused. She wasn't looking for compromise. She was looking for blood. She wanted to hurt them. She wanted to use language that would shock them, shake them out of their privilege, and force them to feel the raw anger of the streets. Yet y'all are the ones, she pivoted, her finger jabbing the air, accusingly pointing at the Republican side. It is this administration that is bringing crime to the streets. Wait, what? The Republicans blinked. Did she just say, this administration? For a second, confusion reigned. Was she attacking Biden? No, of course not. She was looking at the Republicans, but the sentence was a tangled mess of projection. She was accusing the Republicans, the party out of power in the White House, the party screaming for law and order, of bringing crime to the streets. It was gaslighting 101. It was the Orwellian inversion of reality. War is peace. Freedom is slavery. Republicans are the ones defunding the police. Chairman Jordan's face remained impassive, but his eyes narrowed to slits. He was a wrestler in his youth, and he knew when an opponent was flailing. Crockett was flailing. She was throwing punches in the dark, hoping anything would land. But in her flailing, she was revealing the utter bankruptcy of her party's position. They couldn't defend the crime statistics. They couldn't defend the open border. So they had to create a fantasy world where the Republicans were the secret masterminds behind the anarchy. That's what's happening, she insisted, as if saying it made it true. The silence from the Republican side was deafening. It wasn't the silence of submission. It was the silence of people watching a car crash. They were witnessing a member of the United States Congress completely abandon the tether of reality. And then the snort. It was a small sound captured by the high-fidelity microphones. Snorts, a derisive, unladylike, unparliamentary sound of pure contempt. To the Republicans, that sound was more offensive than any word she could have spoken. It was the sound of dismissal. It was the sound you make at a subordinate you despise. It signaled that she didn't view them as colleagues. She didn't view them as equals. She viewed them as obstacles to be bulldozed. The tension in the room was now physical. You could feel it in the way the stenographer's shoulders hunched. You could feel it in the way the Capitol Police officers standing by the doors shifted their weight, their hands hovering near their belts. The civility of the House was a thin veneer, a layer of gold leaf over rotting wood, and Crockett was scratching it away with her fingernails. A junior Republican member, sitting on the far end of the dais, felt a wave of nausea. He had come here to make a difference. He had come here to debate tax policy and infrastructure. Instead, he was trapped in a reality TV show where the script was written by lunatics. He looked at Crockett and saw the future of American politics. Loud, angry, fact-free, and utterly devoid of grace. The breakdown was accelerating. The micro-expressions on the Republican faces told the story. A clenched jaw here, a furrowed brow there, a shaking head. They were the adults in a room that had been taken over by the children. They were holding the line, but the line was fraying. Crockett took a breath. A big one. She was winding up. The Republicans didn't know exactly what was coming next, but they knew it wouldn't be good. They knew that the decency she had demanded earlier was about to be abandoned completely. They could see it in her eyes. The fire was burning too hot. The boiler was about to burst. The atmosphere was electric with the static charge of impending doom. It was the quiet before the thunderclap. The moment where the roller coaster reaches the peak and hangs there, suspended in terrifying stillness before the plunge. She was about to cross the Rubicon. She was about to introduce a word into the congressional record that would stain the proceedings and turn the hearing into a viral spectacle. The Republicans braced themselves. They tightened their grips on their pens. They stared straight ahead, refusing to flinch. Let her do it, Chairman Jordan thought, his mind sharp and cold as ice. Let her show the American people exactly who they are. And then she opened her mouth. The moment arrived not with a bang, but with the slippery, casual ease of a street brawl spilling into a church. Jasmine Crockett was quoting the Mayor of Minneapolis. To the Republicans, this was already an act of provocation, citing the leadership of a city that had become the poster child for progressive failure. But they expected bad policy citations. They expected flawed logic. They did not expect the linguistic grenade that she pulled the pin on next. The mayor of Minneapolis told y'all to get the expletive out. She said it. She didn't whisper it. She didn't abbreviate it. She didn't sanitize it for the record. She dropped the F-bomb into the microphone with a casualness that suggested she was ordering lunch, not addressing the Judiciary Committee of the United States House of Representatives. The word hung in the air, vibrating with a toxic energy. For a split second, the room froze. It was the micro-expression of collective shock. On the Republican dais, pens stopped moving. Heads snapped up in a synchronized motion of disbelief. It wasn't that these men and women hadn't heard the word before. They were adults. Many were veterans, former prosecutors, business owners. They knew the language of the world. But here, in this room, under the seal of the United States, it was a violation. It was a desecration. The silence that followed was heavy, like the sudden drop in pressure before a tornado touches down. And then the reaction hit. Whoa! A Republican member breathed out, the sound involuntary. To the GOP members, this was the moment the dam finally broke. For years, they had watched the slow erosion of standards. They had seen dress codes relaxed to allow gym shorts on the Senate floor. They had seen the State of the Union turned into a heckling contest. But this was the bottom. This was the moment the dignity of the institution was taken out back and shot. Chairman Jordan's eyes widened, a flash of genuine astonishment breaking through his stoic mask. He leaned forward, his hand hovering near the gavel, his mind likely racing through the parliamentary rules regarding obscenity. But before he could act, before the clerk could even type the four-letter word into the eternal record of American history, the chaos deepened. A voice from the Republican side, sharp, offended, and rightly so, cut through the noise. It was a demand for order, a demand for basic civilization. It's a third incident where somebody has dropped an F-bomb in this committee, the Republican voice noted, weary and disgusted. It was a plea for sanity. Are we really doing this? Are we really going to degrade ourselves to this level? But Crockett wasn't done. She hadn't just crossed the line. She had erased it. And when challenged, she didn't retreat. She didn't apologize. She didn't say, "Mr. Chairman, I withdraw my unparliamentary language." No, she attacked. "Are your princess ears okay?" she sneered. The phrase hit the Republican side like a splash of acid. Princess ears. The misogyny was breathtaking. The hypocrisy was blinding. Here was a woman who had spent the last 5 minutes lecturing them on humanity and decency, who had invoked the death of a woman to shame them, now turning around and unleashing a high school-level insult at a female colleague across the aisle. Representative Anna Paulina Luna, the target of the barb, though unnamed in the immediate shout match, sat frozen for a millisecond, processing the sheer audacity of the slur. It was a mean girl's moment transplanted into the halls of power. It was petty. It was small. It was beneath the office. But to the pro-Republican observer, it was also revealing. It showed exactly what the modern left thought of conservative women. If you were a conservative woman, you weren't a girl boss. You weren't a queen. You were a princess, fragile, spoiled, weak. It was a sexist trope weaponized by the very people who claim to own the patent on feminism. Is it profanity? Crockett challenged, her voice dripping with mock innocence. Your princess ears offend you? The Republican members looked at each other, communicating in a silent language of shared outrage. This is it, their eyes said. This is the end of the House. The room descended into bedlam. The room is a character was now a riot zone. The hum of the lights was drowned out by the rising crescendo of voices. The polite, muffled sounds of a legislative hearing were replaced by the sharp, jagged edges of an argument you'd hear in a parking lot at 2 a.m. The gentle lady is offending your princess ears? Crockett repeated, seemingly delighted by her own wit. She was playing to the cameras now. She knew this would be a TikTok soundbite. She knew her base, the angry, online mob, would eat this up. Slay, queen, they would type, ignoring the fact that she was actively destroying the decorum that allowed democracy to function. Mr. Chairman, a Republican voice boomed. Cutting through the din, it is the gentle lady, killing them. The gavel banged. Crack, crack, crack. It was the sound of authority trying to assert itself over anarchy. But the sound was hollow. The gavel is a symbol of order, but it only works if the people in the room respect the symbol. And it was clear, abundantly clear, that Jasmine Crockett had zero respect for the symbol, the room, or the people in it. It is the gentle lady's time, the chairman said, his voice strained. He was trying to follow the rules. He was trying to be the adult. He was granting her the time she was technically owed, even though she was using that time to set the room on fire. This was the tragedy of the Republican position. They were bound by rules that their opponents felt free to ignore. They were playing chess while the other side was playing flip the table. Would you stop the clock for a moment? Crockett demanded, acting as if she were the one being inconvenienced, as if she were the victim of the disruption she had caused. The sheer narcissism of the moment was staggering. On the Republican dais, a veteran congressman rubbed his temples, his eyes closed. He was visualizing the headlines. He knew how the media would spin this. They would say GOP pounces on Crockett's speech. They would say Republicans triggered by word. They would ignore the insult. They would ignore the breach of protocol. They would make Crockett the hero who spoke truth to power, even if that truth was wrapped in profanity and personal attacks. The chair will remind all members, the chairman began, his voice measuring every syllable, trying to pour concrete over the cracks in the floor, that the person controlling the time is not to be unreasonably interrupted. He was defending her right to speak, even after she insulted them, even after she cursed. That was the Republican way. Adhere to the process. Trust the system. We would further admonish, the chairman continued, that whenever possible to express the full meaning of something, it be done so without an expletive that may be offensive to people here in the audience or those who watch us on television. It was a gentle rebuke, a grandfatherly scolding. Please don't say the F word on TV. But to the MAGA base watching at home, and to the Republicans in the room, it felt insufficient. They wanted her mic cut. They wanted her censured. They wanted consequences. But they knew there would be none. In the current political climate, consequences were a relic of the past. The chairman tried to offer an olive branch, a way out. "I understand that a quote at times is essential," he said, offering a generous interpretation of her motive. "But I would admonish everyone to use such things as F-bomb in order to get the message out without actually using the word." It was a reasonable request. It was the standard of decency that had governed this body for 200 years. But as the camera cut back to Crockett, the Republicans saw no contrition. They saw no shame. They saw a smirk. She had gotten what she wanted. She had derailed the hearing. She had made it about her. She had turned a discussion about policy into a discussion about her swag. Notwithstanding that, the chairman sighed, the weight of the entire dysfunctioning government in his voice. "The gentle lady will be recognized for this time, plus an additional 20 seconds. He gave her more time. A murmur of dissent rippled through the GOP ranks. "Reward the bad behavior," a member thought bitterly. "That's the new American way. If you break the rules, you get a bonus." Crockett adjusted her microphone. She looked around the room, her eyes lingering on the Republican women she had just insulted. There was a triumph in her gaze. She knew she had won the news cycle. "Thank you, Mr. Chair," she said. The princess ears comment hung in the room like a foul odor that the HVAC system couldn't cycle out. It sat there, a testament to the new low. It wasn't just an insult. It was a symptom. It was a symptom of a party that had become so convinced of its own moral superiority that it felt justified in dehumanizing anyone who disagreed. The Republicans watched her, their faces hardening into masks of grim determination. The shock had passed. Now, there was only resolve. They realized with crystal clarity that there was no reasoning with this. You couldn't debate princess ears. You couldn't write a white paper to counter an F-bomb. The political struggle had shifted phases. It was no longer a debate. It was a siege. And as Crockett prepared to use her extra 20 seconds, the Republicans dug in. They would not scream back. They would not descend to her level. They would let her speak, let her fill the record with her bile, and trust, perhaps naively, perhaps heroically, that the American people were watching and that the American people would see the difference between a princess and a patriot. But deep down in the quiet corners of their minds, they wondered, does anyone actually care anymore? Or is this just entertainment now? The gavel rested on the wood. The lights hummed, and the silence of the room screamed. The gavel struck the sounding block, not with the sharp, authoritative crack of a judge's hammer, but with the dull, weary thud of a tool being used to fix a machine that was fundamentally broken. "The gentle lady may continue," the chairman said. To the Republicans sitting in the tiered rows of the dais, those 4 words felt like a surrender. They were the white flag waved by civilization in the face of barbarianism. The room, which had just been subjected to the verbal equivalent of a flashbang grenade, the F-bomb, the princess ears slur, the utter degradation of parliamentary language, was now being asked to return to business as usual. It was a surreal request. It was like asking passengers on the Titanic to please return to their shuffleboard game after the iceberg had just torn through the hull. A senior Republican member, a man with the constitution of a bulldog and the patience of a saint, leaned back in his leather chair, the springs groaning under the weight of his frustration. He looked at the chairman and saw the impossible position he was in. If the chair silenced Crockett, the Democrats would scream censorship and racism and misogyny within seconds. The clips would be on CNN before the gavel even stopped vibrating. If he let her speak, the dignity of the House continued to bleed out on the floor. It was the classic conservative dilemma. Play by the rules and lose, or break the rules to win and become what you hate. The chairman had chosen the rules. He had restored her time. He had even given her an extra 20 seconds, a stupidity tax paid by the House for the time wasted by her own outburst. "Thank you, Mr. Chair," Crockett said. Her voice had shifted again. The raw, screaming anger was gone, replaced by a dismissive, breezy tone that was, in its own way, even more insulting. It was the tone of someone who knows they are untouchable. She didn't apologize. She didn't acknowledge the chaos she had just birthed. She simply stepped over the debris of decorum she had created and kept walking. "Long story short," she began. "Long story short?" A Republican aide, standing in the back of the room, shook his head, looking down at his shoes. You just nuked the committee's reputation, called a colleague a princess, and cursed on live TV. And your transition is, long story short? The casualness was a power move. It signaled that to Jasmine Crockett, the rules of the House were nothing more than suggestions, mere speed bumps on her road to social media stardom. We are sitting in Judiciary, she continued, her voice gaining speed, and no one on that side of the aisle seems to care that this particular person, whose name we don't know at this point, became the judge, jury, and executioner. The phrase hung in the air: judge, jury, and executioner. On the Republican side, eyes narrowed. The irony was so dense it had its own gravitational pull. You don't know the name, thought a Republican congressman, a former prosecutor who had spent decades in the courtroom. You just admitted it. We don't know the facts. We don't know the threat level. We don't know if the officer was under fire. We don't know if there was a weapon. Yet in the same breath, Crockett had already assigned roles. She had made the officer the executioner. She had made the deceased the victim. And she had made the Republicans the uncaring accomplices. She was doing exactly what she accused the officer of doing. She was acting as the judge. She was the jury. And she was executing the reputation of law enforcement without a shred of due process. The room, as a character, felt disjointed, schismatic. On the left side of the room, the Democratic staffers were nodding, their faces grim masks of agreement, completely bought into the narrative that police are inherently dangerous. On the right side, the Republican staffers were stiff, their jaws set, watching a masterclass in the subversion of justice. I don't know how you square that, Crockett challenged. We square it with the Constitution. The collective mind of the GOP responded silently. We square it with the presumption of innocence until proven guilty. We square it by waiting for the investigation instead of starting a riot. But logic had no place here. This wasn't a debate about legal standards. It was a sermon on the mount of woke ideology. And then came a pivot, the real reason for the theatrics. And then we're sitting here literally in markup for a bail funds bill, she said, her voice dripping with disdain. Ah, thought the chairman, his eyes flickering with recognition. There it is, the bail funds bill, the legislative meat on the bone. For the last 10 minutes, the Republicans have been wondering why she was talking about a random ICE shooting during a markup session. Now, the connection snapped into place. She was using the shooting, an emotional, violent, tragic event, as a smokescreen to defend one of the most controversial, dangerous policies of the modern Democrat platform, the bail fund complex. The Republican members straightened up. This was their turf. If she wanted to talk about bail funds, they were ready. To the GOP, bail funds were not charitable organizations helping the poor. They were engines of recidivism. They were the mechanisms that put violent criminals back on the street hours after they were arrested. They remembered the Minnesota Freedom Fund, championed by Kamala Harris, which had bailed out rioters, domestic abusers, and even a murderer who went on to kill again. The cognitive dissonance of Crockett's argument was staggering to the conservative mind. She was screaming about a woman being killed by law enforcement, an event that, while tragic, was an enforcement action, and using it to argue against a bill that would stop criminals from being released to kill more women. When I first ran for office, Crockett said, shifting into storytelling mode, it was in the midst of yet another lynching by law enforcement in Minneapolis. Lynching. The word landed with a thud. A shudder of revulsion went through the Republican ranks. To use that word, a word soaked in the blood of American history, a word that described the extrajudicial murder of innocent black men by mobs, to describe modern police interactions was not just hyperbole, it was incitement. She calls it a lynching, a Republican member thought, looking at the seal of the United States above the chair. She calls a police officer doing his job, perhaps making a mistake, perhaps not, a lynch mob. It was a disqualifying level of rhetoric. It delegitimized the entire system of justice. If every police use of force is a lynching, then there is no law. There is only war. At that time, it was George Floyd, she said, invoking the name that had set the country on fire in 2020. The room seemed to darken. The ghosts of 2020 entered the chamber. The burning precincts, the shattered storefronts, the autonomous zones, the billions in damage. the lives ruined not by police, but by the chaos that followed. To the Democrats, George Floyd was a martyr. To the Republicans, his death was a tragedy. Yes, but the reaction to it, the systematic dismantling of law and order, was a national catastrophe. And here was Crockett, trying to summon that same chaotic energy back into the room. She was trying to reopen the wound. Snorts, she made that sound again. That dismissive, arrogant intake of air. I remember working as a pro bono criminal defense attorney to help protesters that were being arrested, she boasted. The Republicans watched her, unimpressed. Protesters, she called them. The GOP members remembered the intelligence briefings. They remembered the Molotov cocktails. They remembered the lasers shown in officers' eyes. They remembered the frozen water bottles thrown like bricks. You weren't helping protesters, a veteran congressman thought, his eyes cold. You were helping rioters avoid the consequences of their destruction. This was the fundamental divide. To Crockett, the people burning down the AutoZone were heroes fighting oppression. To the Republicans, they were criminals destroying their own community. And she was proud of helping them get back on the street to throw another brick. There were more than 600 protesters that were arrested in Dallas. She cited the number like a badge of honor. To the Republican side, that number represented 600 instances where the police had to intervene to restore order. It represented 600 failures of civil society. There were churches that came together to make sure that there were bail funds, she said, wrapping her radicalism in the cloak of religion. The hypocrisy grated on the GOP members. They were the party of faith. They were the ones who actually went to church on Sundays, who believed in the literal word of God. And here was a progressive Democrat, a member of a party that often treated religion with open hostility, using churches as a shield for a political operation. Don't dare, thought a devout Christian Republican from the South. Don't you dare use the church to justify releasing violent offenders. But she was daring. She was doing it. She was weaving a narrative where the bail funds, unregulated, unaccountable pots of dark money often funded by coastal elites, were actually just humble church groups doing the Lord's work. It was a brilliant, twisted piece of fiction. There were, nonprofit organizations, she stumbled slightly, perhaps realizing that nonprofit sounded less holy than church. And to explain how it works for bail, since we're in judiciary and we're writing the laws, she condescended, assuming that the Republicans, many of whom were lawyers, former judges, and constitutional scholars, didn't understand how bail worked. The arrogance was suffocating. It filled the room like a gas leak. And some people may not understand this, she lectured, looking directly at the GOP side, imply their ignorance. But those bail funds, those nonprofit organizations, are not the ones that determine whether or not somebody gets bail. She was technically correct, but ethically bankrupt. The judge sets the bail. The bail fund pays it. But the GOP argument, the one she was deftly sidestepping, was that these funds paid bail indiscriminately. They didn't care if the person was a danger to the community. They didn't care if the person had a rap sheet a mile long. They just paid. They were an automated get-out-of-jail-free card for the chaotic elements of society. The chairman watched her, his face a mask of weary endurance. He knew he couldn't stop her. She had the floor. She had the time. All he could do was let her paint herself into a corner. He looked at his colleagues. He saw the fatigue in their eyes. They were tired of being called racists. They were tired of being called stupid. They were tired of the gaslighting. But they sat there. They sat there because that is what adults do. They endure the tantrum so that the house doesn't burn down. But the asylum was getting louder. Crockett was building up steam again. She was moving from the what, bail funds, to the why, Republican cruelty. What they do is they help out poor people, she said, her voice dropping into a register of accusatory pity, which I know y'all are not interested in either. There it is, the Republicans thought. The kicker, it wasn't enough to disagree on policy. She had to impugn their motives. You hate poor people. It was the oldest, laziest line in the Democrat playbook. It ignored the fact that Republican economic policies created jobs. It ignored the fact that inflation, driven by Democrat spending, was the biggest tax on the poor in history. It ignored the reality that safe streets are the most important civil right for the poor, who are the primary victims of crime. But facts didn't matter in the asylum. Only feelings mattered. And Jasmine Crockett was feeling very, very righteous. The GOP members felt a collective hardening of their hearts. If this was the dialogue, this mix of insults, lies, profanity, and moral preening, then there was no dialogue. There was only the standoff. The chairman checked the clock. Her time was ticking down, but the damage she was doing to the fabric of the committee was permanent. She wasn't just debating a bill. She was salting the earth. As she prepared for her final crescendo, bringing up the rich and famous and the Epstein defendants, the Republicans realized that this wasn't just a speech. It was a manifesto of resentment, and they were the designated villains in her story. The order in the room had been technically restored. No one was yelling "princess" anymore, but the spirit of the room was dead. It had been murdered, right there on C-SPAN, by the politics of personal destruction. The transition was so abrupt it could have caused whiplash. 1 minute, Representative Jasmine Crockett was the street-fighting pugilist, tossing F-bombs and princess insults like hand grenades into the trenches of the Judiciary Committee. The next minute, she was smoothing her papers, adjusting her glasses, and ascending the invisible steps to the pulpit. The Republicans watched, mesmerized by the sheer audacity of the performance. They were witnessing the quintessential maneuver of the modern progressive politician, the pivot from profanity to piety. But they help out people that aren't rich and famous and have limitless amounts of money, she intoned, her voice taking on the rhythmic cadence of a Sunday morning preacher. Here comes the class warfare, thought a Republican member from the South, shifting his weight in the leather chair. He knew this song by heart. In the Democrat hymnal, wealth was a sin and poverty was a virtue, unless, of course, the wealth belonged to their donors in Hollywood or Silicon Valley. Then it was philanthropy. But for the purposes of this hearing, the rich were the enemy. Crockett was building a straw man so large it blocked out the lights in the ceiling. She was painting a picture where the Republicans were the sinister guardians of the aristocracy, twisting their villainous mustaches while the poor rotted in dungeons. It was a caricature that would have been funny if it weren't being entered into the congressional record. Like all of the Epstein defendants, she said, dropping the name like a smoking gun. The heads on the Republican dais snapped up. Epstein? Who somehow y'all can't find even though y'all went and got Maduro. The logic, if one could call it that, was a tangled knot of conspiracy and deflection. Chairman Jordan blinked. The sheer incoherence of the attack took a moment to process. She was blaming the Republicans for the Department of Justice's failure to prosecute Epstein's clients. The same Department of Justice currently run by Merrick Garland. The same Department of Justice that the Republicans have been grilling for months about unequal application of the law. We aren't the ones hiding the list, Jordan thought, the internal monologue sharp and cold. We are the ones demanding the files. We are the ones subpoenaing the records. But facts were irrelevant in the Church of Crockett. She wasn't making a legal argument. She was throwing red meat to the conspiracy theorists on TikTok. By linking the Epstein defendants, a universal symbol of elite corruption, to the Republican stance on bail funds, she was trying to create a subliminal association. Republicans protect pedophiles but want to jail the poor. It was a smear of epic proportions. It was dirty. It was dishonest. And it was delivered with the straight face of a true believer. A younger GOP member, a man who had left a lucrative law practice to serve his country, felt a burning sensation in his chest. It was the indigestion of swallowed rage. He wanted to grab the microphone. He wanted to scream, "We don't control the FBI right now. Your party does. If you want Epstein's clients, call the White House." But he stayed silent. He knew that engaging with the insanity only validated it. You don't argue with a person who is hallucinating. You just make sure they don't hurt anyone. Crockett, however, was just warming up. She was done with the conspiracy theories. Now, she was going for the soul. Why it is that you want to criminalize people, such as churches that are trying to help the poor, she asked, her voice trembling with righteous indignation. Churches. The word hung in the air, shimmering with false sanctity. To the Republicans, this was the ultimate gaslight. They knew exactly who was running the bail funds. It wasn't the little Baptist church on the corner holding bake sales to free a wrongfully accused parishioner. It was massive, dark money NGOs. It was the Minnesota Freedom Fund. It was organizations funded by George Soros and the Tides Foundation. These were political machines disguised as charities dedicated to the ideological goal of emptying the prisons. But Crockett called them churches. She was wrapping the radical left's agenda in the vestments of the clergy. She was using the cross as a shield to protect a policy that had led to murderers being released back onto the streets to kill again. Because they understand what the Bible says, she lectured, looking down her nose at the Republican side of the aisle. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. This was dangerous territory. The Republican Party is, by and large, the party of the faithful. These were men and women who started their meetings with prayer, who kept Bibles on their desks, not as props, but as guides. To be lectured on Scripture by a woman who had just defiled the hearing with the F word was a level of cognitive dissonance that was physically painful. "Don't quote the book to me," thought a senior representative, a man who taught Sunday school every week back in his district. "Don't you dare quote the book to justify lawlessness." He knew his Scripture. He knew Romans 13. "Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established." He knew that the Bible commanded justice. Yes, but it also commanded order. It did not command the release of violent criminals to prey on the innocent. But Crockett wasn't interested in theology. She was interested in a bludgeon. "And they don't just say that they understand it or say that they love Jesus," she sneered, the implication clear. "You Republicans say you love Jesus, but you are liars." It was a direct attack on their faith. It was the Pharisee accusation. She was calling them hypocrites. She was telling the world that their Christianity was fake because they didn't support her radical bail reform policies. But they decide that they actually put it into works, she continued, building to her crescendo. "Because faith without works is dead." She quoted James 2, verse 26. The irony was suffocating. "Faith without works is dead." The chairman mused silently. "Indeed. And what are the works of your policies, Ms. Crockett?" The Republicans looked at the works of the policies she was defending. They saw the smoldering ruins of Minneapolis. They saw the smashed windows of small businesses in D.C. They saw the crime rates spiking in every major Democrat-run city. They saw the dead bodies of innocent citizens killed by repeat offenders who had been bailed out by these so-called charities. "Those are your works," the collective GOP mind screamed in silence. "Chaos, destruction, death. That is the fruit of your tree." But in the hearing room, there was only the sound of her voice, echoing off the mahogany walls, filling the space with a sanctimony so thick you could cut it with a knife. She was positioning herself as the moral superior, the crusader for justice, the true Christian, and she was casting the Republicans, the people trying to uphold the laws of the land, as the heartless, godless villains. It was a masterclass in political inversion. Crockett paused, letting the Scripture hang there, letting the accusations sink in. She looked around the room, challenging anyone to dispute her interpretation of the gospel. The Republicans sat like stone statues. They refused to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. They knew that if they engaged her on theology, the headline would be "GOP attacks Bible verse." They were trapped in a rhetorical box constructed of their own decency. "That is wrong too," she concluded, judging them. "And I'm here to tell you," she stammered slightly, the adrenaline perhaps catching up to her, "that there's going to be a lot of nonprofit organizations that are going to step up in this moment." She was pivoting back to the threat, the promise of more unrest. "Because there are going to be protests around this entire country," she warned. Protests. To the Republicans, that word had lost its innocent meaning years ago. In 2024, protests was often a euphemism for riots. She wasn't predicting civil disobedience. She was promising mobilization. She was telling them, if you don't do what we want, the streets will fill up. The noise will return. The chaos will come back. It was a veiled threat, wrapped in the guise of a prediction. "Because of the state-sanctioned execution that we all saw unfold," she declared. State-sanctioned execution. She was back to the ICE shooting. She had come full circle. She had started with the tragedy, woven through insults, profanity, conspiracy theories, and bad theology, and arrive back at the beginning, delegitimizing the state. To call a police shooting, one that hadn't even been fully investigated, a state-sanctioned execution, was to declare war on the very concept of law enforcement. It implied that the government was a murder machine. It implied that the police were death squads. Representative Chip Roy looked at her, his eyes cold and hard. He saw the danger in this rhetoric. It wasn't just political grandstanding. It was corrosive. It ate away at the trust that held society together. If people believed their government was executing them, then violence against the government became justified. She was playing with fire, and she was doing it in a room full of paper. Unless there is some kind of justice that takes place, she added, the conditionality of the threat hanging in the air. Justice as defined by me. Or else. And we get the name of that officer, and that officer is prosecuted. Prosecuted. Not investigated. Not tried. Prosecuted. She had already decided the outcome. The trial was over. The verdict was guilty. The sentence was demanded. This was the justice of the mob. It was quick. It was emotional. It was absolute. And it was completely terrified of facts. The Republicans watched the clock. The seconds were ticking away. Her time was almost up. The sermon was ending. But the aftertaste remained. It was bitter. It tasted of ash and hypocrisy. They had just been lectured on morality by someone who had weaponized a tragedy. They had been lectured on faith by someone who preached division. They had been lectured on the law by someone who had already decided the guilt of a man she had never met. The chairman prepared to reclaim the floor. He prepared to bring the room back to reality. But he knew, with a sinking feeling, that for millions of people watching this clip online, reality didn't matter. They didn't want the law. They wanted the sermon. They wanted the anger. They wanted to believe that they were the righteous rebels fighting the evil empire. And Jasmine Crockett had given them exactly what they wanted. As she took a breath to make her final motion, the Republicans braced for the last act. The sermon was over. Now came the stunt. The air in the committee room had changed. The ozone scent of electrical fire, the metaphorical result of Jasmine Crockett's scorching rhetoric, was beginning to dissipate, leaving behind the stale, recycled atmosphere of a government building that had seen too much history and too little progress. Crockett was nearing the end of her runway. She had exhausted the lexicon of outrage. She had used the tragedy. She had used the insults. She had used the profanity. She had used the Bible. Now, she needed the closing act, the call to action. So I asked that law enforcement. We have oversight over them, she declared, her voice still carrying the tremor of her earlier performance. The statement hung there, redundant and obvious. We have oversight over them. Chairman Jim Jordan didn't blink. He didn't need to. The entire existence of this committee was oversight. That was the job description. But in Crockett's mind, oversight didn't mean reviewing budgets or checking compliance with federal statutes. It meant punishment. It meant the public flogging of the men and women in blue. I'm the oversight ranker, she announced. The title was delivered with the gravity of a medieval queen proclaiming her lineage. I am the oversight ranker. To the Republicans on the dais, the declaration bordered on the comical. It was an appeal to authority from someone who had spent the last 10 minutes dismantling the very concept of authority. It was a reminder of rank from someone who had shown zero respect for the rank of the chairman or the dignity of her colleagues. You're a ranker, thought a senior GOP aide, watching from the wings. But you're ranking in a system you despise. You wear the pin, but you hate the uniform. But go ahead, she said, making a decision on the fly. The gears were turning. She was going off script. The inner monologue of the Republican side sensed the shift instantly. She was about to pull a procedural stunt. In fact, I make a motion, she said, her voice rising with the thrill of the maneuver, that we have a hearing in the Oversight Subcommittee as it relates to this particular issue and what took place. There it was, the motion. In the theater of modern politics, the motion is rarely about actually achieving a legislative outcome. It is a prop. It is a way to force a vote or a ruling that can be clipped, captioned, and shared with the caption. Watch Republicans block a hearing on justice. The Republicans knew the game. They knew that motions made during a markup session for an unrelated bill were typically out of order. They knew that she hadn't cleared this with the leadership. They knew it was a violation of the scheduling protocols. But none of that mattered to her. She wasn't playing for the record. She was playing for the real. Second, a voice chirped from the Democrat side. It was a weak, reflexive sound, a dutiful echo, the chorus backing up the soloist. It highlighted the isolation of the maneuver, a sudden, frantic attempt to hijack the proceedings before the cameras turned off. The room held its breath. The room, as a character, seemed to contract, focusing all its energy on the chairman. Jim Jordan sat motionless. He didn't look angry. He didn't look flustered. He looked bored. Not the boredom of disinterest, but the boredom of a professional athlete watching a novice try to perform a trick they haven't mastered. He leaned into the microphone. His voice was flat, devoid of the emotion that Crockett had been spraying around the room like graffiti. The gentle lady was not recognized for purposes of motions, he ruled. Simple, clean, final. It was the bureaucratic equivalent of a door slamming shut. There was no shouting match. There was no debate on the merits of the shooting or the bail funds. There was just the cold, hard steel of the rules. You don't have the floor for that, the ruling said. Sit down. To the Republicans, this was the victory. It wasn't a victory of rhetoric. They hadn't screamed back. It was a victory of order over chaos. It was the triumph of the institution over the individual. Crockett had tried to break the wheel, and the wheel had simply kept turning, indifferent to her rage. Crockett paused. She looked at the chairman. For a split second, the micro-expression on her face revealed a flicker of genuine frustration. The stunt hadn't worked. The explosion had been contained. The viral moment would end with her being ruled out of order, a less triumphant conclusion than she had hoped for. She didn't argue. She knew she had no ground. The theater was closing. Does anyone else seek recognition? The chairman asked, his eyes scanning the room. He looked left. He looked right. He looked at the Republicans, who sat with their hands folded, their faces masks of disciplined silence. They had so much to say. They wanted to scream about the princess ears comment. They wanted to demand an apology for the F-bomb. They wanted to tear apart her faith without works argument piece by piece. But they didn't. This was the silence of the Patriots. It was a strategic silence. To speak now would be to extend her time in the spotlight. To speak now would be to turn a monologue into a dialogue, validating her behavior as a legitimate form of debate. By staying silent, by refusing to engage with the insanity, they were starving the fire of oxygen. Seeing no others, the chairman said. The gavel came down. Thud. The sound was final. The hearing was adjourned. The markup was over. The show was over. The red tally lights on the cameras blinked off. The tension in the room broke, not with a snap, but with a long, slow exhale. The Republicans began to gather their papers. The rustle of documents, the clicking of briefcases, the scraping of chairs against the floor. These mundane sounds returned, reclaiming the space from the high drama of the last 10 minutes. Representative Chip Roy stood up, buttoning his jacket. He looked across the aisle. The Democrats were huddling around Crockett, patting her on the back, likely congratulating her on speaking truth to power. They were smiling. They were checking their phones, probably already watching the playback on Twitter. They think they won, Roy thought, a grim realization settling in his gut. They think because they made the most noise, they won the argument. He turned to a colleague, a fellow conservative from a quiet district where people still stood for the anthem and knew their neighbors' names. You believe that? The colleague asked, shaking his head, his voice low. Princess ears. I believe it. Roy replied, his voice rough with suppressed anger. This is who they are now. There is no filter. There is no bottom. It's going to be everywhere tonight, the colleague sighed, tucking a folder under his arm. The media will love it. Fiery Crockett shuts down GOP. That's the headline. Let them have the headline, Roy said, walking towards the exit. We have the work. They moved towards the heavy wooden doors of the committee room. The walk felt longer than usual. They were walking through the debris of institutional norms. Every F-bomb, every personal insult, every conspiracy theory uttered in that room was a crack in the foundation of the republic. And the Republicans felt the weight of trying to hold the roof up while the other side was busy taking a sledgehammer to the pillars. As they stepped out into the hallway, the noise of the Capitol hit them. The tourists, the lobbyists, the click-clack of heels on marble. It was the sound of the machine churning on. But inside the mind of the Republican leadership, the alarm bells were ringing. Chairman Jordan lingered for a moment at the dais, handing the gavel to a clerk. He looked out at the empty seats where the Democrats had just been performing. They don't want to govern, he realized with crystal clarity. They want to rule. And if they can't rule, they want to ruin. The difference was stark. Governing requires compromise, patience, and a respect for the slow, grinding gears of the process. Ruling requires force. Ruining requires only chaos. Crockett's performance wasn't an anomaly. It was a preview. It was a trailer for the movie they intended to play on a loop until November. A movie where Republicans were racists, where police were executioners, where decency was a weakness, and where the loudest voice was the only one that mattered. Jordan picked up his jacket, throwing it over his shoulder. He felt the fatigue of the battle. It wasn't physical tiredness. It was a spiritual exhaustion. The cost of maintaining civilization is high when the barbarians are not at the gates, but sitting on the committee. He walked out of the room, his stride purposeful. The silence of the Patriots wasn't a surrender. It was a reloading. They would go back to their offices. They would write the bills. They would issue the subpoenas. They would talk to the press, not with F-bombs, but with facts. They would go home to their districts and tell their constituents what they saw. They saw a party that cares more about a viral clip than a dead woman, Jordan thought. They saw a party that laughs at order. The hallway stretched out before him, lined with the statues of great Americans. Men who had faced civil war, depression, and world wars. They looked down with stony gazes. We held the line, then, the statues seemed to say, "You must hold the line now." The princess ears comment would fade. The F-bomb would be beeped out on the evening news. But the scar on the institution would remain. As the Republicans left the Rayburn building, stepping out into the humid Washington air, they knew the fight was far from over. In fact, the real fight, the fight for the soul of the country, for the very definition of what is decent and true, had only just begun. They walked in silence, a phalanx of suits against the setting sun. They were the adults in the room, and in 2024, that was the loneliest job in America.